I was holding my phone when a child's voice said, "Mom can't wake up." And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about myself went quiet. The call wasn't meant for me. I dialed one wrong digit while walking through the underground garage beneath my building, the concrete still warm from the engines of cars that cost more than most people's homes. I remember the echo of my footsteps, the faint smell of oil and rainwater, the way my mind was already rehearsing the board meeting I'd been avoiding all week. I was Alistair Gray, CO, numbers man, praised for being cold enough to make hard decisions. That's what people said when they thought it was a compliment. "Hello," I'd said, impatient, ready to correct the mistake. Then the boy spoke again. "Sir, are you a doctor?" His voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatic, just tired, like a child who'd been strong for too long. I should have hung up. That's the truth. I should have ended the call, redialed the correct number, and gone on with my evening. Instead, I leaned against a concrete pillar and asked him his name. "Arlo," he said. "I'm 9. I asked where his mother was. He told me she was on the couch, that she'd been sick for weeks, that she said she just needed to rest. He told me his brothers were asleep in the bedroom, that he didn't want to wake them because they got scared when the ambulance came last time." The word ambulance lodged itself somewhere under my ribs. I asked him where he lived. He hesitated, like he'd been told not to give that information to strangers. Then he gave me the address anyway. I heard the sound of a refrigerator humming in the background, a television murmuring to no one. "I think she's not breathing right," he whispered. I stayed on the line while I called emergency services with my other hand. My voice, usually so steady, sounded unfamiliar even to me. When I told Arlo help was coming, he thanked me like I'd handed him something precious. Before the paramedics arrived, he asked me if I could stay on the phone. "Just until they knock," he said. I stayed. That night was the first crack in a life built carefully to avoid exactly this kind of mess. Before that call, my days were neat, predictable. I woke before sunrise in an apartment that smelled faintly of coffee grounds and polished wood. I read financial reports while the city stretched awake beneath my windows. I wore suits chosen by someone else, ate meals designed for efficiency rather than pleasure. People listened when I spoke, nodded when I entered rooms. They called me decisive, ruthless, when they were feeling honest. I told myself solitude was a preference, not a consequence. My mother had raised me to believe work was a form of virtue. She died when I was 19, after an accident at a manufacturing plant that cut corners the way men in power always insist is necessary. The investigation dragged on for years. No one was held responsible. I learned early that grief doesn't change outcomes. Documents do. Evidence does. Influence does. So I built a life. I didn't marry. I didn't have children. I kept my relationships clean and temporary. When people disappointed, me and they always did, I told myself it was proof that distance was wisdom. That's who I was before Arlo's voice followed me home. The next morning, I called the hospital under the pretense of checking on a community outreach statistic. It took 3 transfers and a lie I didn't enjoy telling, but eventually a nurse confirmed that Alara Vance was stable. Severe infection. Untreated for too long. I wrote her name down on a yellow legal pad. I kept on my desk for thoughts. I didn't want digitized. Alara Vance. The name tugged at something I couldn't place. I told myself it was nothing. People like me didn't chase coincidences. We let them pass, but I didn't. I'm right. That afternoon, between meetings about quarterly forecasts and a pending acquisition, I searched our internal archives. It was meant to be a distraction, something to quiet the itch under my skin. Instead, I found her. Alara Vance, former safety supervisor, terminated 3 years ago. Ass and destined. Reason for termination: failure to align with company reporting standards. I stared at the line until the words blurred. I remembered the year she'd been fired. A string of safety complaints from one of our subsidiary plants. My director at the time, Preston Blackwood, had assured me it was handled. Minor issues. Exaggerations. He'd smiled when he said it, the way men do when they think reassurance is the same as truth. I closed the file and told myself I was reaching, that a wrong number and an old HR record didn't make a story, that I was projecting meaning onto noise. Still, I went to see her. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and weak coffee. Elara lay pale against white sheets, her dark hair pulled back, her face thinner than the photograph in our records. Arlo sat in a chair beside her bed, his feet not quite touching the floor. He looked up when I entered, eyes narrowing with suspicion until recognition bloomed. "It's you," he said, not smiling, just certain. Elara woke as I stood there, unsure of what I was about to say. Her eyes focused slowly, sharpening when she saw me. I recognized that look. I'd seen it across conference tables when people realized exactly who held the leverage. "You," she said quietly. "No accusation, just fact." I introduced myself, unnecessarily. I told her I'd spoken to her son, that I was glad she was recovering. She thanked me, but her voice carried a distance that... When Arlo excused himself to get a snack from the vending machine, Elara looked at me fully for the first time. "I didn't dial you by mistake," she said. "I used to have your number memorized." Something cold slid down my spine. "For emergencies," she continued, "back when I believed it would matter." We sat in silence, the machines marking time for us. I thought about my mother, about the reports I'd skimmed instead of reading, about the kind of man I decided to be. "I think," I said finally, "that we should talk." She held my gaze, tired but unbroken. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to say that. Outside the room, a child laughed. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped steadily, stubbornly alive. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a wrong number at all. It was an opening. And once opened, some doors don't close quietly. Elara asked me to close the door before she spoke again, as if the hallway itself had ears. The latch clicked softly, and in that small sound, something shifted. I sat in the chair Arlo had vacated, suddenly aware of how out of place I looked in a room built for vulnerability. Mux, to dem. My suit jacket hung stiff against the plastic backrest. The tie felt tighter than it had that morning. "You didn't come here out of kindness," Elara said. Her voice was calm, not bitter. That was what unsettled me. Men like you don't survive on kindness. I didn't argue. I'd learned long ago that denying an accurate observation only wastes time. "I came because your son called me," I said, "and because I recognized your name." Her eyes flickered, just once. "So you finally read the reports?" "I read the summary," I corrected. "Back then." She let out a slow breath, the kind that carries years in it. "That's how it always starts. Summaries. Condensed truths that fit neatly between meetings." She told me then about the plant, about the cracked pressure valves that were logged and relogged, about the maintenance requests that disappeared from the system overnight, about how she'd been told, to sign off on revised safety reports after an incident that sent 2 men to the hospital with burns that never quite healed right. "I said no," she said. "I said no 3 times. The 4th time, Preston stopped asking. The name hung between us. He said I was emotional," she continued, "that I was letting my personal ethics cloud my professional judgment. He told me I'd regret making things difficult." "And you did," I said. She met my eyes. "I regret trusting that the company I gave 10 years to would protect its people." There was no drama in her delivery, no raised voice. Just the steady accounting of a woman who'd already paid the cost of honesty. After I left the hospital, I didn't go back to the office. I walked instead, past cafes and construction sites, past men in hard hats whose lives depended on signatures they'd never see. I called my assistant and told her to clear my evening. That night, I pulled the full safety audit from the year Elara was fired. Not the executive summary, not the board-facing version, the raw data. It took hours to decrypt. I worked until my eyes burned and my hands shook, not from fatigue, but from recognition. The numbers told a story no one wanted told. Incident rates adjusted after her termination, risk assessments downgraded without corresponding repairs. And Preston Blackwood's name appeared everywhere it shouldn't have, authorizing revisions, approving timelines, recommending terminations. By morning, my certainty had calcified into something heavier, I went to see Preston first. He was exactly where he always was, corner office, glass walls. He smiled when I entered, the same practiced warmth he used on investors and interns alike. "Alistair," he said, rising to shake my hand. "Early start." "Not early," I said. "Late." He gestured for me to sit. I remained standing. "Do you remember Alara Vance?" I asked. The pause was half a second too long. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Unfortunate situation. She couldn't align with company culture. She refused to falsify safety reports." His smile thinned. "That's an interpretation. It's a fact," I said, placing a folder on his desk. "Along with these." He glanced down just long enough to know he'd been caught. When he looked back up, the charm was still there, but the calculation had sharpened. "You're overreaching," he said. "If this comes out, it won't just hurt me. It will hurt the company, the board. You." I thought of my mother's hands, always smelling faintly of soap and metal. Of the way her death certificate reduced her to a line item. "I've already been hurt," I said. "The question is whether you're willing to be held accountable." He laughed softly. "Accountability is a luxury afforded to people without share." That was the moment I knew this would end in public. I reinstated Alara the following week. The call I made to her apartment was deliberate this time. Arlo answered again, his voice brighter when he recognized me. I heard younger voices in the background, his brothers, I assumed, arguing over something trivial and alive. When Alara came on the line, she listened without interrupting as I offered her position back. Senior role, full authority, an apology that felt insufficient, even as I said it. "I won't work under Preston," she said. "You won't," I replied. "Not for long." The board meeting was scheduled for Friday. The room was full of men who'd built their careers on plausible deniability. They sat in leather chairs, sipping water, reviewing agendas they assumed would remain unchanged. Preston sat 2 seats down from me, his expression composed. I began with numbers. I always did. Charts, trends, projections. The language of safety, translated into profit margins and risk exposure. Heads nodded, pens moved. Then I introduced Alara. She walked in carrying a box. Not dramatic, just practical. Inside were original reports, emails, time-stamped photographs. The kind of evidence that doesn't need embellishment. He objected. He accused. He deflected. I watched the room change as understanding set in, as men realized the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they'd believed. When the vote came, it wasn't unanimous. It didn't need to be. Preston was removed by the end of the hour. "What else did?" Dumber said. "Was it?" Afterward, Alara and I stood alone in the empty boardroom. The city looked different from that height. Less like a conquest, more like a responsibility. "I didn't expect you to risk everything," she said. "I didn't expect to care," I replied. She studied me for a long moment. "People can change," she said. "But only when they let themselves feel what they've been avoiding." I thought of Arlo's voice on the phone, of the way a wrong number had rerouted a life. "I'm trying," I said. She nodded, accepting that as truth, for now. The day Preston Blackwood packed up his office, the building felt quieter, not relieved, just watchful. I stood at my window and watched him cross the lobby, a cardboard box tucked under his arm, his shoulders squared like a man who believed dignity was something you carried, not something you earned. No one stopped him. No one applauded. Consequences rarely arrive with ceremony. Alara started the following Monday. Her office was smaller than Preston's had been by design. Not as a slight, but as a statement. Glass walls, no corner. Visibility in every direction. She didn't comment on it, but I saw her take in the layout, the way she'd once taken in factory floors and emergency exits. "You'll have autonomy," I told her on her first day. "Budget authority, direct access to the board. No revisions without your sign, off." She nodded. "Then we'll need to rebuild the reporting system from scratch." "Do it," I said. In the weeks that followed, my routine shifted in ways I didn't anticipate. I found myself reading full reports instead of summaries, asking questions that didn't fit neatly into agendas, sitting in meetings longer than necessary, listening instead of at home, if the apartment could be called that. I slept poorly. not from stress but from awareness. The quiet I'd cultivated for years now felt unfinished, like a sentence cut off mid-thought. I started visiting Alara's apartment on Sundays. It began as logistics, groceries she couldn't carry easily while recovering, paperwork she needed help filing, but the space itself resisted efficiency. The walls were crowded with school drawings, the refrigerator plastered with notes and reminders. There was always a pot simmering on the stove, something simple and forgiving. Arlo greeted me like a fixture rather than a guest. His brothers, Jonah and Micah, were slower to warm, but curiosity softened them. They asked me what I did. I told them I worked in an office. "That's boring," Jonah said flatly. "I agree," I replied, and Alara laughed from the kitchen, a sound that surprised us both. One evening, as the boys argued over a board game, Alara and I sat at the small table near the window. She was stronger then, color returning to her cheeks. She moved carefully but without fear. "You don't have to keep coming," she said, not unkindly. "I know," I said. "I want to." She studied me, the way people do when they're deciding whether to trust a change. "My life doesn't come in pieces," she said. "If you're here, you're here. All of it." I thought of how often I'd left rooms the moment conversations became inconvenient, of how I'd trained myself to exit before attachment took root. "I understand," I said. She nodded, satisfied for now. At work, the consequences of our decision rippled outward. Regulators requested audits. Journalists asked questions. Investors expressed concern dressed up as curiosity. I answered what I could, refused what I couldn't justify. Some nights I wondered if I'd miscalculated, if doing the right thing would cost more than I was prepared to pay. Alara never wavered. She worked long hours, not to prove herself, but because she knew what was at stake. I watched her in meetings, how she listened first, spoke last, how she refused to soften language when clarity was required. "You're making enemies," I told her once, after a particularly tense board call. She smiled faintly. "I already had them. The boys started calling me Mr. Gray, then Alistair, then, eventually, just Al. It was Micah who asked me why I didn't have a family. We were sitting on the floor, assembling a model airplane with instructions that made no sense. I Tembleton, and Fimbleton, Amadiaten." The question came without preamble, the way children ask things adults circle for years. I focused on other things, I said. "Like money?" he asked. "Yes," I said. Because lying felt pointless. He considered this. "Does it keep you warm?" Alara looked over from the couch, her eyes soft but attentive. I didn't answer right away. "No," I said finally. "It doesn't." That night, as I drove home, I passed the old manufacturing plant where my mother had died. It had been repurposed into loft apartments now, the past sanded down and repainted. I pulled over and sat in the car, the engine idling, the radio off. For the first time in years, I let myself remember her laugh, the way she'd hum while folding laundry, the way she'd trusted systems that never deserved it. I realized then that what I was building with Alara wasn't redemption. It was responsibility, delayed but deliberate. The public reckoning came faster than expected. An investigative piece broke midweek, detailing the safety violations, the altered reports, the internal resistance that had been silenced. My name appeared alongside Preston's, not as an accomplice but as a turning point. The board voices were raised, futures were threatened. I listened, hands folded, heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. When they asked if I'd do it again, risk the company, my position, my reputation, I answered without hesitation. "Yes," I said, "and I'll keep doing it." After the meeting, Alara found me in the hallway. "They won't forget this," she said. "Neither will I," I replied. She hesitated, then placed a hand on my arm. "Not possessive, not grateful, just human. Thank you," she said, "for choosing people over protection." I thought of Arlo's voice on the phone, of a wrong number that had been right in every way that mattered. "I didn't choose perfectly," I said, "but I chose consciously." That night, my apartment felt less like a refuge and more like a waiting room. I knew then that the life I'd built was no longer sufficient. That the walls, I'd relied on were thinner than I'd believed, and for the first time I didn't rush to reinforce them. The first time Alara trusted me with something other than work, it wasn't a confession. It was a folder. She placed it on my desk without ceremony, the manila edges worn soft from being opened and closed too many times. We were alone in my office, the city dulled by rain outside the windows. The hum of traffic below sounded like a distant ocean. I kept copies, she said, of everything. I didn't open it right away. I'd learned that some things deserved a pause. Inside were emails Preston had never meant to be seen again. Threads marked urgent, confidential, verbal approval only. There were spreadsheets with numbers that didn't add up unless you knew where to look. Photos taken quietly, from angles meant to avoid notice. Cracked valves, rusted supports. Men working double shifts under lights that flickered like they were tired too. These aren't just violations, I said. They're patterns, Alara replied, and they didn't stop when I left. I felt something settle in my chest, heavy but clear. The board needs to see this. They will, she said. But not until we're ready. She was right. Timing wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. We spent evenings cross-referencing documents, building a narrative that couldn't be dismissed as isolated or emotional. She was meticulous. I was relentless. Between us, there was a balance I'd never experienced before. Outside of work, the boys started waiting for me. Not literally at the door. Alara would have stopped that. But in small ways. Jonah saved me a seat on the couch. Micah asked if I'd be back next Sunday. Arlo watched me with a quiet seriousness that made me feel both seen and measured. One night after dinner, Alara walked me to the door. "They're getting attached," she said softly. "So am I," admitted. She didn't look away. "This doesn't end neatly, Alistair. There will be fallout. Attention, pressure." "I know," I said. "I'm not here for neat." She studied me, then nodded. "Neither am I. The boardroom showdown came on a Tuesday. We'd framed it as a routine update, progress on safety reforms, preliminary findings. The directors filed in, some curious, some wary. Legal counsel sat in the back, notebooks open. I began with a reminder of our stated values, not as performance but as context. Alara followed with data. She spoke calmly, deliberately. No accusations. Just facts, presented in sequence. When she laid out the timeline, how reports had been altered, how risks had been reclassified, how Preston's directives had created a culture of silence, the room grew still. One director interrupted, voice sharp. "Are you suggesting intentional misconduct?" Alara met his gaze. "I'm suggesting documented misconduct." She slid copies of the emails across the table. The sound of paper moving felt louder than it should have. When Preston's name appeared again, this time tied to directives that resulted in injuries, the temperature shifted. Legal counsel leaned forward. Someone swore under their breath. I watched faces harden, then pale. When it was over, no one spoke for a long moment. Finally, the chairman cleared his throat. "This will require full disclosure." "Yes," I said. "It will. And if regulators impose penalties, we'll pay them," I replied. "And we'll fix what allowed this to happen." There were arguments. Of course there were. Amin said. Concerns about stock prices, public trust, leadership stability. I listened, then stood. "If the cost of protecting people is my position," I said, "then I accept that cost." Silence again. This time, heavier. The vote that followed wasn't about Preston. He was already gone. It was about whether the company would continue to manage risk or confront it. When the decision came down in our favor, Alara exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for years. Outside the boardroom, she leaned against the wall, eyes closed. "It's done," she said. "It started." The press descended within days. My phone filled with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, some congratulatory, some cautionary. I ignored most of them. At Alara's apartment, the boys watched the news with the volume low. "That's you," Jonah said, pointing at the screen. "You look serious." "I am serious," I said, "but that doesn't mean I'm angry." Arlo watched me closely. "Are you in trouble?" I considered the question. Maybe, I said, but sometimes trouble is the right place to be. He nodded, accepting that answer the way children accept truths that feel earned. Later, after the boys were asleep, Alara and I sat at the kitchen table. The light above us flickered slightly, the bulb nearing the end of its life. You could have walked away, she said. No one would have blamed you. I would have, I replied. She smiled, small and tired. That's new for you. Yes, I said. It is. In the weeks that followed, I made a decision that surprised even me. I asked Alara to lead a new division, independent, fully empowered, reporting directly to the board and external regulators. No interference. No compromise. No compromise. She read the offer twice. You're giving me authority, she said slowly. Real authority. I'm giving the company a conscience, I said. One it can't fire. She laughed then, a sound that filled the room. You know they'll hate this. I know, I said. They'll get used to it. She extended her hand. I took it. The partnership we formed wasn't built on trust alone. It was built on shared memory of harm done and responsibility reclaimed. And somewhere in the middle of all that work and reckoning, something quieter took root. Belonging. The first time I realized I was no longer alone, it wasn't in a boardroom or a headline. It was in a grocery store aisle, arguing over cereal. Micah wanted the one with the cartoon tiger. Jonah insisted it was basically candy. Arlo stood between them, reading the nutritional label with exaggerated seriousness, as if 8 grams of sugar might determine the fate of the household. Alara watched from the end of the aisle, arms crossed, amusement softening the lines fatigue had etched into her face. You don't have to get involved, she said to me. I'm already involved, I replied, handing Micah the cereal and Jonah a compromise. Leadership requires sacrifice, she laughed, shaking her head. You'd negotiate with a wall if it had opinions, only if it mattered, I said. That was the thing. It did matter. At work, the consequences of our choices continued. Regulatory audits became routine. The Independent Safety Division, ILERA, led uncovered issues that had been ignored for years. Repairs cost money. Delays frustrated investors. But injuries dropped. Near misses became rare. People went home whole. I attended the first site visit with her quietly. No, we wore hard hats and steel-toed boots. The air smelled of oil and metal, a scent that carried memory for me. A worker recognized me. His eyes widened. You're him, he said. Not accusatory, just surprised. I am, I replied. He nodded once. My brother worked here. Before the changes. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it in a way I hadn't learned before. That night, Alara and I sat in the living room after the boys were asleep. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant siren of a passing ambulance. You're different, she said. I was always this, I replied. I just kept it buried. She considered that. People don't change because they're told to. They change because something reaches them where numbers can't. I thought of a child's voice on the phone, of fear unfiltered by pride. I know, I said. The press attention eventually faded, replaced by newer scandals, louder outrage. But the internal shift remained. People spoke up more. Reports came in unedited. Meetings grew longer, less comfortable, and more honest. Some nights, I still wondered if I'd done enough, if the scale of what had been hidden. Alara seemed to sense those moments. You can't undo harm, she said once, handing me a mug of tea I hadn't asked for. But you can stop repeating it. I nodded, grateful for the clarity. The boys started inviting me to things. A school play, a science fair. A soccer game where Micah spent more time watching clouds than the ball. I attended quietly, sitting on folding chairs, clapping when appropriate. One afternoon, after Arlo's presentation on renewable energy, he found me in the hallway. You didn't have to come, he said. I wanted to, I replied. He hesitated. My dad used to say that too. I waited. He didn't mean it, Arlo continued. But I think you do. The words landed gently, but they stayed. Alara and I never named what was happening between us. We didn't need to. It lived in shared glances, in late-night conversations that drifted from work to memory to possibility, in the way she'd lean against the counter when she was tired and I'd noticed before she said anything. One evening, as we washed dishes together, she spoke without looking at me. "I'm afraid," she said. "Of what?" I asked, as believing this lasts. I dried my hands slowly. "I can't promise permanence," I said, "but I can promise presence." She turned then, studying my face. That might be enough. The appointment was announced quietly. Elara Vance, head of independent safety, and the division reported directly to regulators as well as the board. It was unprecedented. The backlash was immediate and manageable. What surprised me most was the support. Letters from workers, emails from families, people who'd been waiting to see if someone in power would choose differently. I kept one letter on my desk. It read simply, "Thank you for seeing us." At home, because by then that's what Elara's apartment had become, the boys argued over who got the last slice of bread. Elara scolded them gently. I watched, a strange warmth settling in my chest. Later, as I prepared to leave, Arlo stopped me at the door. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded, satisfied. "Okay." In the car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The city lights blurred slightly through the windshield. I thought of the life I'd built to avoid this kind of attachment, the cost of it, the emptiness I'd mistaken for peace. I realized then that power, real power, wasn't about control. It was about care, the kind that risks being changed in return. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of that risk. The public consequence arrived the way storms usually do, predicted, discussed, but still disruptive when they finally hit land. The regulators released their findings on a gray Thursday morning. Violations confirmed, fines imposed, mandatory oversight instituted across 3 subsidiaries. The stock dipped hard before noon, recovered slightly by close, and became the lead story on every financial channel that night. I watched none of it live. Instead, I sat in Elara's living room, the television muted, Jonah sprawled on the floor with a book he wasn't reading, Micah building something elaborate out of mismatched blocks, and Arlo at the table doing homework with the kind of focus that comes from knowing someone is watching. Elara stood by the window, arms folded, eyes distant. "This is the part where people start rewriting the story," she said. "They always do," I replied. "They'll say it was inevitable. That leadership corrected course at the right moment. And you?" she asked, turning toward me. "I'll say we waited too long," I said. "And that we're still paying for it," she nodded. "That answer won't make you popular." "I'm not aiming for popular," I said. "I'm aiming for honest." The backlash inside the company was quieter but sharper. Senior managers who'd built careers on silence suddenly found themselves accountable. Some resigned. Others stayed and adjusted, learning, slowly, that transparency wasn't a threat if you weren't hiding. The board called me in for a closed session the following week. The room felt different now, less assured, more careful. One director leaned forward, fingers steepled. "You've changed the culture of this organization," he said. "Whether intentionally or not." "Yes," I replied. "There are those who believe you've gone too far." I met his gaze. "There are those who believe we hadn't gone far enough." Silence followed. Then a woman I'd rarely heard speak cleared her throat. "My husband worked at one of our plants," she said quietly. "For 20 years, he came home every night smelling like metal and sweat. I used to worry every time the phone rang." She looked at Elara, who sat beside me. "I don't worry as much anymore," the woman continued. "For that alone, I support this direction." The vote that followed secured the future of the safety division permanently. My position remained intact, not because I was untouchable, but because too much had changed to undo it quietly. When I told Elara, she closed her eyes and let out a breath she'd been holding since the day she was fired. "They can't erase it now," she said. "No," I agreed. "They can't." Life settled into something resembling rhythm. Mornings were still early, but no longer empty. Cumber. Evenings often ended at Elara's table, plates mismatched, conversation overlapping. The boys began leaving their shoes by the door without being told. I found a toothbrush in the bathroom that hadn't been there before. One Sunday afternoon, as we folded laundry together, an activity I'd never imagined sharing with anyone. Alara spoke softly. My father used to say institutions don't change, she said. Only people do. I think people forget that institutions are made of people, I replied. She smiled. You'd argue with him. I'd respect him, I said. Then argue. She laughed, and the sound felt like something earned. Minus didn't. The press eventually asked about us. Not directly, at first. Questions about priorities, about work, life balance, about how leadership decisions were influenced by personal experiences. I answered carefully. My perspective has broadened, I said. That's not a weakness. At home. What were you like as a kid? Jonah asked one night. Serious, I said. Quiet. Did you have fun? Micah asked. Not enough, I admitted. Arlo watched me thoughtful. You can still, he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. The true consequence, I realized, wasn't professional or public. It was internal. I could no longer pretend ignorance was innocence. I could no longer separate my choices from their impact. Power, once felt, couldn't be unfelt. And love, unexpected, unplanned, had a way of dismantling the last defenses. One evening, as Alara and I stood on the balcony watching the city lights blink on one by one, she spoke without looking at me. I don't need you to save us, she said. I know, I replied. I need you to stay, she continued, even when it's complicated. I turned to her then. I've spent my life avoiding complications, I said. I don't want to anymore. She reached for my hand, tentative but certain. I took it. Below us, traffic moved steadily, indifferent to the small, profound shifts happening above. In that moment, I understood that justice isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with triumph. It settles quietly into the places where harm once lived and insists on being remembered. And healing, real healing, doesn't erase scars. It teaches you how to live with them honestly. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in increments, small, unremarkable moments that only revealed their weight in hindsight. It came when Micah fell asleep during a movie, his head heavy against my shoulder, trusting without knowing why. When Jonah asked me to help him practice a speech, his voice steady but his hands shaking. When Arlo started leaving his school backpack by the door the way I left my briefcase, as if our routines had begun to overlap, Alara watched these things quietly. She never pushed, never asked for declarations or promises. Her strength had always been rooted in realism, not hope alone. One night, after the boys were asleep, she poured 2 glasses of wine and sat across from me at the table. I need to tell you something, she said. I nodded, bracing without showing it. When I was fired, she continued, I lost more than a job. I lost faith in systems, in fairness, and people who say they'll protect you. I listened, hands folded, the room dim except for the lamp above us. I promised myself I wouldn't rely on anyone again, she said. Not emotionally, not financially, not in ways that could be taken away. And now, I asked. And now I'm afraid I'm breaking that promise, she said. With you. The honesty in her voice was the most intimate thing she could have offered. I can't guarantee I won't disappoint you, I said, but I can guarantee I won't disappear. She studied my face, then nodded. That matters more than you know. The boys sensed the shift before it was ever named. Jonah asked if I was staying for dinner more often. Micah asked if I'd help him build a treehouse in the spring. Arlo asked nothing at all, which somehow meant everything. At work, the safety division released its first annual report. Unfiltered, unpolished. The findings were uncomfortable. The response, mixed, but the changes were undeniable. In a meeting with senior leadership, a manager raised a concern about costs. Alara responded evenly. The cost of prevention is the cost of neglect is buried. No one argued. The company began to shift from fear-based compliance to something closer to responsibility. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. One afternoon, I visited my mother's grave for the first time in years. The cemetery was quiet, the air cool. Seared. I stood there longer than I intended, hands in my coat pockets, words forming and dissolving before they reached my mouth. I tried to fix it, I said aloud. I don't know if that counts. I imagined her smile, not approving, not disappointed, just present. I'm learning, I added. That felt true. When I told Alara where I'd been, she didn't speak right away. She reached for my hand instead. She'd be proud, she said. I didn't argue. The boys met my sister shortly after. She flew in unexpectedly, curiosity finally outweighing distance. We sat around the table, introductions. Careful but warm, she watched me with something like amazement. I didn't think you were capable of this, she said later, when the boys were in the other room. Neither did I admitted. She smiled. People surprise us when we stop controlling the outcome. The question of permanence came up quietly, the way real questions do. Not in ultimatums or declarations, but in logistics. School zones, commutes, space. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Alara spoke. The boys are settled here, she said. Their school, their friends. I know, I replied. I don't want to uproot them, she continued. But I also don't want to pretend this is temporary. I took a breath. Neither do I. We didn't decide everything that night. We didn't need to. Some things grow better without force. Weeks later, I gave up my apartment. Not dramatically, not with a speech. I packed boxes slowly, thoughtfully, leaving behind things I no longer needed. The space felt hollow in a way it never had before. Not lonely, just finished. When I arrived at Alara's place with the last box, Micah watched from the couch. Is that all your stuff? He asked. Yes, He considered this, then nodded. Okay. That was it, no ceremony, no questions. The first night I slept there, truly slept, I woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. The house creaked softly around us. Somewhere a clock ticked. I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Peace, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of connection. In the morning, Alara handed me a mug of coffee. You're here, she said. I am, I replied, and I meant it in every sense of the word. There are nights now when the house is loud in the way only life can make it. Arguments over homework, laughter spilling down the hallway, the low murmur of Alara's voice as she reminds the boys, again, to brush their teeth. These sounds don't disrupt my thoughts anymore. They anchor them. Sometimes I think back to the man I was before a wrong number found its way into my phone. A man who believed distance was safety, who thought leadership meant never letting anyone see where you could be reached. I didn't become softer because I lost something. I became braver because I finally let something in. The company still faces scrutiny. It should. Power deserves a long memory. Alara's division continues to challenge old habits, and I support her not because she needs it, but because it's right. Accountability isn't a phase, it's a practice. As for us, there was no grand declaration, no moment where everything became perfect. We chose consistency over certainty. Some evenings, Arlo sits beside me and asks questions about work, not the numbers, but the people. Who makes the decisions? Who gets protected? I answer him honestly, even when the answers are uncomfortable. Because that's the lesson this life taught me. Integrity isn't proven in moments of applause. It's proven in quiet choices, when no one is watching and someone is depending on you anyway. If you'd told me years ago that my greatest transformation would come from listening instead of leading, from answering a call that wasn't meant for me, I wouldn't have believed you. But here I am. And I wonder if the phone rang tonight, and the voice on the other end needed you in a way you didn't expect. Would you answer? If this story moved you, if it made you pause or reflect on the choices you're making, I hope you'll share your thoughts. And if you want to hear more stories like this, quiet, honest, and rooted in real life, consider subscribing and supporting the channel. Until next time, take care of each other.